once I've worked out how to do it. Yes, okay. Sorry folks, just slight technical difficulties. My presentation just crashed. Always the way. Okay, okay, right. Can you all see that okay? Can you get a thumbs up if you can see it? Yep. Perfect, great. Okay, so hi, my name is David. I'm a director of a new company called Habitat People based in Aberdeen. We're a sort of rewilding organisation. We're helping people to improve biodiversity on their lands, their farms, their estates, building habitat, basically, it's in the name. As you can see, yeah, funded last year. I used to work for the RSPB as an ornithologist, but so do this now. We started a little wildflower nursery. Anyway, so the subject of this talk is going to be talking about early successional rewilding and the benefits of biodiversity you can have in improving your land and thinking more long term about what it is exactly that you're looking at. So yeah, I want just a few assumptions briefly for this talk. First, you know you're going to be planting a native woodland, not going to be putting those lodgepole pines in from earlier. You're not doing this as a massive commercial venture, and you want to increase biodiversity, basically. So what does wildlife need? I'm sure lots of you know this already, but really basic management techniques on the ground level can have a really significant impact on improving the biodiversity you have. And that's again very dependent on the land you have. If you have got a wet, a lot of the woodlands I'm working with farmers to plant at the moment are very wet. We're looking at planting trees like alders and willows rather than birches and Scots pines because they'll do better. They're slightly less common species in the local area as well, so we're providing a bit more diversity to the habitat. And yeah, I would always buy native. Again, I'm sure you all know that already. Okay, so some general things to consider when you're wanting to improve biodiversity is thinking about what this area is going to look like over the long term. I'm going to be talking about the short term this year, this year in this talk, but I would call 10, 15 years a short term for a woodland. And how you manage it now will have very long-term ramifications in terms of overall structure and diversity. Making sure that you have different areas that have different light levels, relevant pH you have, lowering nutrient levels if you can, and making sure it's an area that you want as well. I think when it comes to planting woodlands, I think some people feel like you have to completely make it solely for nature, almost to the extent where you can't go into it. Keeping it accessible, keeping it enjoyable for yourselves is also really key to allowing you to enjoy it and also to monitor it more easily. Okay, so as some general rules when buying in plants, please don't buy in with peat-based compost. It's really not necessary. We've seen some fantastic bog habitats and peatlands in some of the other presentations today. There is far more alternatives available than I can possibly count. It's just not necessary. I feel like some of these points to this particular audience are just going to be obvious, so I'm going to move on from that. Okay, so overall diversity. So again, this is just going from the experience I have working with people, but in general, the number of woodlands, the size of the woodlands are, 5, 10 hectares, maybe a couple of acres. And it's a lot better to have a larger area of one or two very focused habitats. So as a single mix of trees rather than trying to have lots of different dotted areas to really build up a bigger area and therefore providing a bigger pool in the local metapopulation than having lots of different spots to have small areas for different species. And also when the woodland comes to mature as well, it will be less fragmented in the overall habitat. And as things come in naturally anyway and self-seed or disperse into the woodlands, that will allow you to see that if you're alive once it gets to a mature stage. Each way has your advantage. I mean, I've got a picture of again, I find it quite difficult to find lots of images of very kind of medium young woodlands. People seem to like taking images of very mature woodlands and just planted woodlands. The kind of intermediate stages seem to be less popular, but got a stream coming through here. So again, start thinking about whether you want to be planting willows and alders along the edges of that, and then going out into an oak or a lime woodland, depending on what you have in your local area. If you're right next to an ancient woodland that's full of Scots pine, then extend what you have, and it can. I mean, when you're doing that, once you've planted your woodland up, try and do at least some monitoring. See how the ground floor is doing. Once a year in the spring. Make sure that you haven't lost lots of the trees to deer or to voles. Yeah. So initial diversity. Some of the things that I like to try and encourage people to do is think of your early woodland as a grassland. Basically, it's a grassland with some very, very tall herbs in that are going to grow into trees. So you may as well make the most of that. Plant it as if you can, rotate the land before you plant the trees, sow a meadow, and then plant the trees into the already diverse meadow, because that will increase ground flora. That will help with the mycorrhiza that discussed earlier, becoming established and overall better for health as the woodland gradually begins to take hold over a period of years. Thinning woodland, some people find it is quite hard thing to go through and cut out 20% over 5 years, if it's in particularly extreme cases, of all the lovely trees they've planted. But maintaining good light levels is critical, and shrubs as well. When you're actually planting the woodland, I'd really encourage people to plant as many shrubs as they can in the different areas where they've designed glades or woodland edges. They will grow faster, but they also provide shelter for the young trees, and increase overall diversity. If you find them becoming too overzealous in their growth, you can always cut them back. And it's worth considering how you're going to start caring for this woodland 5, 10, 20 years on. If you're managing it as a meadow and it starts to become more mature woodland after 7, 8 years, as often happens with the birch, Scots pine as they get bigger, consider getting some cattle in, consider changing up. And it's a gradual change as well. Perhaps have cattle in for a week in the first year you're going to have them in, and then 2 weeks, and then depending on the size of the area and the stocking density, you can change that around. So making sure you have that as part of the initial ideas, I think, is really important, because then you're in control, you know what's going on, and because hopefully you've had a little idea of what the species mix is in there, you can see what's changing and whether you're not going to cause any long-term damage from doing things like grazing. So just a bit of fun. What is wrong with this picture? There's quite a lot wrong with this picture, other than the fact that they're planting trees. That's great. They're all in rows. All of these trees have very thick tree tubes. They're probably not biodegradable. So as soon as these trees get old enough and the trees split or get blown off or get damaged, that particular tree is going to be very open to the wind. It's going to cause damage. The ground floor there, I can see maybe 2 species of grass as well. You're not making use of that area. A lot of wildflowers put down really big tap roots that can help with carbon sequestration early on in the woodland's life. So you're not making the most of that. So trying to get the most out of that woodland before it is a established wood with a thick canopy is really beneficial as well, and can reap rewards further down the line. So yeah, again, I was just using some examples of shrub layers going into the woodlands. So one of the things that I often see driving around, going around the Cairngorms and Aberdeenshire, is all of these fantastic woodlands, but they've only got a grass layer, and then they have the high canopy. There's no intermediate layer of shrubs along the border, along the edges, that can be really critical to a large amount of species. I'm sure a lot of the more academics in here have heard about layered habitats. But yeah, if you've got a high canopy and a grassland, there will be species that can use both of those. There'll just be species that can use just the woodlands, just the grasslands. But you lose out on a lot of the opportunity from a more natural successional habitat. So you suddenly introduce a shrub layer, there we go, and you have all the different interactions. So you've got things going from the upper grasses to the woodlands, the upper grasses to the shrub layer, and then you've got the ground level invertebrates. I'm largely talking about invertebrates here. Invertebrates being using the shrub layer at the ground level, at the trees at the ground level. My words are getting very mixed up, I do apologise. And you've got all these different microhabitats that you have opening up that you wouldn't otherwise have in a system with just high trees and grasslands. So getting those shrubs in early makes a big difference. Another thing I want to talk about is things like song thrush. I'm sure you'll know what song thrush is. It's a species that's declined very heavily over the last 50 years. This is largely also due to woodland management practice, so removal of shrub layer and of shrub boundaries from woodlands and from the borders with farmlands and woodlands. And that actually affects the moisture content of the soil in the woodland. It makes the soil much harder, which makes it more difficult for the invertebrates that song thrush prefer to survive. It also makes it more difficult for the beaks of song thrush, which are particularly soft, to penetrate the soil, so it takes longer for them to forage for less invertebrates. So if you have a shrub layer on the outside of your woodland or along the edges of your glades, what it means is the overall moisture content in woodland is much higher and therefore has more vertebrates and is much better for song thrush breeding. In the shrub layer themselves as well, you'll have the birds breeding very close where they're foraging. That can make a really big difference in species like that. Okay. Oh, come on, slide. Thank you. Deer management has also been shown to have quite significant impacts on song thrush populations because they're not browsing the shrub layer nearly as much. They're not reducing shrub layer. I'm not saying that you should plant shrubs everywhere, but in appropriate locations along the edges of woodlands and in glade areas, it's worth considering that even though you've just planted your saplings, in 10 years' time, this area will be a suitable enough height to potentially support some of these species. So if you plant them now, you don't then have to wait for the gap to be there in a habitat before providing for them. You're already starting to think ahead about which species can be used in your area. What's the woodland going to be internally like? Yeah. It's also worth thinking how you want the overall woodland structure to look in the future. So wood warbler on the left there, red list species doing very badly in this country, unfortunately, prefers very open woodlands with very low shrubs, very high tree canopy. So the opposite of what I was talking about with song thrush, and the same can be said for woodcock there. So they prefer more wet areas, wetter woodlands with a bigger shrub layer. So these two species wouldn't necessarily be compatible within the same area of woodland. So what you want that overall climax community to be, even if you never see it within your lifetime, the decisions you make now with regards to what you're putting in and where you're planting your trees, how densely you're planting your trees, what the initial species that are starting to colonize are, can have very long-term ramifications. I mean, not woodland, but it can take 150 years for a grassland right next to a triple SI to look anything like it in terms of diversity, and woodlands are just as complex as a grassland, if not more so. So considering that on a micro scale is quite important. Just a few brief things to consider. As I mentioned earlier, grazing can be a really effective way of controlling your ground flora. I wouldn't consider putting cattle into a very young woodland, but after kind of 10 years, it's certainly an excellent way of, this is a Shetland cow, hardier old breeds that are not very selective in what they eat are fantastic. They break up areas to have new bare ground so that species like orchids and other early successional species can still have space to grow. as I said, thinning your woodland can be very effective as well, particularly the appropriate time, so 10, 15 years in, keeping the ground flora active through good sunlight levels. It's really important to make sure that, I think it's mentioned in one of the other talks earlier, that to have higher sunlight. I've got an next to a whole nest box there, because most whole nest boxing species are found in mature woodlands. They're things like blue tits or great tits are found in mature woodlands. They're not species of early succession. So in providing a whole nest box for them, essentially you are providing an artificial space for that species to live. Things like open nest boxes right next to it are much more likely to support species like redstarts or dunnocks, robins, things that are going to survive in your early successional woodland, so a lot more appropriate. And the very American chap over there is just doing some surveying, saying that, you know, not spending lots of time if you don't have it, but making sure you've got a vague idea of what's going on can really help you to get an idea of whether you want to start introducing some more species. You've had some local extinctions, things along those lines. This is just an array of ground flora, basically, that you can have before your woodland comes up, and make the most while it's being a grassland. Don't think of it as a woodland in waiting. Think of it as a grassland that will become a woodland. You're going through succession. You're going through to create that climax community. Make the most of increasing diversity now as well, because that will set the base layer to improve in the future. Again, an array of species that you can get in early successional woodland to make a difference. And yeah, I think that's me. Thank you very much. Not quite the same caliber as other talks, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
I think it was totally the same caliber, actually, David. It was amazing. And I love seeing all the photographs of birds. I just want to see them all, including the capercaillie, sometime soon. And thank you to all the brilliant speakers we had tonight. You were all different, but you all went together beautifully. And thank you to Matthew, who organised this event. Right, we're going into the Q&A session now.